The fall. The rain hammered against the windows of the penthouse as Samantha Wright stood frozen in the living room, clutching the positive pregnancy test in her trembling hand. And her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and joy as she rehearsed the words she would say to Gregory Walker, the man she loved and the man whose child she carried. And she had imagined this moment would be filled with celebration and happiness. But the cold expression on his face when he walked through the door told her something was terribly wrong. Gregory loosened his tie and poured himself a drink without even looking at her, and his jaw was set in that familiar way that meant he had already made up his mind about something. And Samantha felt a chill run down her spine as she approached him with the test still clutched in her hand. And she opened her mouth to speak, but he cut her off with a wave of his hand. He told her he had been thinking about their relationship and that things were moving too fast, and his career was taking off, and he needed space to focus on his goals. And Samantha stood there in disbelief as his words crashed over her like waves, and she finally held up the test and showed him. And for a moment she saw something flicker in his eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Gregory set down his glass and turned to face her fully, and his voice was cold when he spoke, and he said he was not ready for a child and that this was not part of his plan. And Samantha felt her world crumbling around her as he continued speaking, and he said she needed to leave and that he would have his assistant arrange for her things to be packed and sent to her. And she could not believe what she was hearing, and tears streamed down her face as she begged him to reconsider. But Gregory was unmoved, and he walked to the bedroom and closed the door behind him. And Samantha stood alone in the living room, feeling like she had been punched in the stomach, and everything she had built with him over the past 3 years was being torn away in an instant. And she had given up so much for this relationship, and now she was being discarded like she meant nothing. That night, Samantha packed a small bag with shaking hands and called the only person she knew would help her. And within an hour, a car arrived to take her to Beverly Hills to her family estate. And as she rode through the dark streets, she placed her hand on her stomach and made a silent promise to her unborn child that she would never let anyone make her feel this small again. When she arrived at the Wright estate, the massive gates opened to reveal the sprawling mansion she had not visited in years. And her father, Richard Wright, stood at the entrance with concern etched on his usually stoic face. And without a word, he wrapped his arms around her and let her cry. And for the first time since her mother passed away, Samantha felt like she was truly home.
The transformation. The morning sun filtered through the silk curtains of Samantha's childhood bedroom, and she woke to the sound of birds chirping in the garden below. And for a moment, she forgot about the pain until reality came crashing back, and she placed her hand on her still flat stomach and whispered a promise that everything would be okay. Richard knocked softly on her door, carrying a tray with breakfast, and he sat beside her on the bed with an expression she had never seen before. And he told her that he had not been there for her after her mother died, and that he had buried himself in work instead of being the father she needed. But now he wanted to make things right, and he wanted to help her become the woman she was meant to be. Over these following weeks, Richard introduced Samantha to his world of business and strategy, and he brought her to board meetings and showed her how deals were made and how empires were built. And Samantha discovered she had a natural talent for understanding market trends and negotiating contracts. And her father watched with pride as she absorbed everything like a sponge. Samantha also began taking care of herself in ways she never had before. She hired a personal trainer and worked out every morning, and she ate healthy meals prepared by the estate chef. And she attended prenatal yoga classes and read books about business and entrepreneurship. And with each passing day, she felt stronger, both physically and mentally. One afternoon, Richard called her into his study and presented her with a proposal. and he said he wanted to invest in her and help her start her own company. And Samantha was overwhelmed by his faith in her. And together they brainstormed ideas, and she remembered her passion for sustainable fashion and how she had always dreamed of creating a clothing line that was both elegant and environmentally conscious. Within months, Samantha launched Right Couture, and her father provided the capital and connections, but she poured her heart and soul into every decision, and she worked tirelessly designing pieces that were sophisticated and modern and ethical. And her pregnancy gave her a new perspective, and she created a maternity line that made women feel beautiful and powerful during one of the most vulnerable times in their lives. The fashion industry took notice, and magazines featured her story, and buyers from major department stores placed orders, and celebrities began wearing her designs. And Samantha's confidence soared as she saw her vision come to life. She was no longer the woman who had been cast aside. She was a creator, and a leader, and a mother-to-be. In quiet moments, she still thought about Gregory and wondered if he ever regretted his decision. She had heard through mutual friends that his business was thriving and that he was dating someone new. The news stung, but it also fueled her determination, and she refused to let him see her as a victim. As her due date approached, Richard threw a small celebration at the estate, and close friends and family gathered to support her, and Samantha stood in the garden, surrounded by love, and realized how much her life had changed. She was no longer running from her pain. She was building something meaningful. And when she held her daughter Emma in her arms for the first time, she knew she had found her purpose.
The invitation. 6 months after Emma was born, Samantha received an elegant cream-colored envelope with gold embossing, and inside was an invitation to the annual Walker family gala. And her heart skipped a beat as she read the details. And the event was known as the most prestigious gathering in the city, where business deals were made and reputations were solidified. Samantha knew Gregory would be there, and she also knew his family had no idea what he had done to her. And the Walkers had always presented themselves as pillars of society and champions of family values. And the irony was not lost on her, and she held the invitation in her hand, debating whether to throw it away or accept the challenge. Richard entered her office at Right Couture headquarters and noticed the troubled look on her face. He asked what was wrong, and she showed him the invitation, and his eyes darkened with anger, but then a slow smile spread across his face, and he told her this was her moment, and her chance to show everyone, including Gregory, exactly who she had become. Samantha spent the next few weeks preparing for the gala, and she worked with her design team to create a gown that would make a statement. They chose a deep emerald silk that hugged her curves and flowed like water when she moved, and the dress had a daring neckline and delicate beading that caught the light. And when she tried it on, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her in the mirror. She also prepared mentally for seeing Gregory again, and she practiced controlling her emotions and reminding herself of her worth. She was no longer the heartbroken woman he had discarded. She was a successful businesswoman and a devoted mother, and a force to be reckoned with. The night of the gala arrived, and Samantha stood in front of her mirror applying the final touches to her makeup. Emma was staying with her nanny, and Richard was her date for the evening. He looked distinguished in his tailored tuxedo, and he squeezed her hand reassuringly as they prepared to leave. As their limousine pulled up to the grand hotel where the gala was being held, Samantha took a deep breath. Cameras flashed as guests arrived, and she could hear the murmur of conversation and live music drifting from inside. And Richard offered his arm, and together they stepped out of the car. The moment Samantha entered the ballroom, heads turned and whispers rippled through the crowd. She held her head high and walked with grace and confidence. Her emerald gown shimmered under the crystal chandeliers, and her presence commanded attention. Across the room, Gregory stood with his new girlfriend, Madison Taylor, and he was laughing at something she said when his eyes landed on Samantha, and the smile froze on his face, and the color drained from his cheeks. And he could not believe what he was seeing. The woman who had begged him through tears was now standing before him, radiating power and success. Samantha caught his gaze and held it for a moment before turning away. She greeted other guests with warmth and charm, and business associates approached her to discuss potential collaborations, and she moved through the room like she owned it. And in many ways, she did.
The confrontation. Gregory could not take his eyes off Samantha as she glided through the ballroom, and Madison tugged at his arm, trying to regain his attention, but he barely heard her. And all he could think about was how different Samantha looked and how confident and radiant she appeared. And a wave of regret washed over him as he remembered the night he had sent her away. The Master of Ceremonies took the stage and announced that the evening's keynote speaker would be a special guest, and someone who had taken the fashion industry by storm in less than a year. And Gregory felt his stomach drop as the spotlight landed on Samantha, and the room erupted in applause as she made her way to the podium. Samantha stood before the crowd with the microphone in her hand, and her voice was steady and clear as she began to speak. And she talked about resilience and transformation and the power of believing in yourself even when others doubt you. And she spoke about building something from nothing and turning pain into purpose. And every word felt like it was aimed directly at Gregory. She shared her journey of launching Right Couture and the challenges she faced as a single mother and entrepreneur. And the audience was captivated by her story and her vulnerability mixed with strength. And when she finished speaking, the applause was thunderous, and people rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Gregory stood frozen as reality crashed down on him. And this was the woman he had thrown away, and the woman carrying his child, whom he had deemed inconvenient, and now she was being celebrated while he stood there with a woman he barely knew, and his success suddenly felt hollow. After her speech, Samantha descended from the stage and was immediately surrounded by admirers and business moguls, and Richard stood proudly beside her, introducing her to influential people. And Gregory watched from a distance as his father, Marcus Walker, approached Samantha with a warm smile and congratulated her on her success. Marcus had no idea that Samantha was the woman his son had been engaged to, and Gregory had kept that part of his life private. And now, watching his father praise the very woman he had discarded made Gregory feel sick, and he knew he had made the biggest mistake of his life. As the evening wore on, Gregory finally gathered the courage to approach Samantha, and he excused himself from Madison and walked across the ballroom with his heart pounding. And when he reached Samantha, she was talking to a group of investors, and she turned to face him with a cool expression. He asked if they could talk privately, and Samantha glanced at Richard, who gave her a subtle nod, and she excused herself from the group and followed Gregory to a quiet corner of the terrace. And the city lights twinkled below them as they stood in tense silence. Gregory struggled to find the right words, and he told her she looked incredible and that he had been following her success in the news. And Samantha remained silent, letting him stumble through his attempt at conversation. And finally, he asked about the baby and whether she had gone through with the pregnancy. Samantha's eyes flashed with anger, and she told him yes, she had their daughter, and her name was Emma, and she was 6 months old and beautiful and perfect. And Gregory's face went pale as the weight of what he had missed hit him. He had a child and a daughter he had never met. He reached out to touch her arm, but Samantha stepped back, and she told him he had made his choice, and he had chosen his career over his family, and now he had to live with that decision. And she said she did not need him, and Emma did not need him, and they were doing perfectly fine without him. Gregory's voice cracked as he apologized and said he had been scared and foolish, and that he wanted a chance to be part of Emma's life. But Samantha shook her head and told him he had no right to ask for that now. He had proven who he was when it mattered most. She turned to walk away, but Gregory grabbed her hand and begged her to give him another chance. And he said he still loved her and that seeing her tonight made him realize what he had lost. But Samantha pulled her hand free and looked him directly in the eyes. She told him love was not just words, but actions. And he had shown her through his actions that he was not capable of the kind of love she deserved. And she said she had spent months rebuilding herself and learning to stand on her own. And she was not about to let him back in just because he regretted his choices.
The victory. Samantha walked back into the ballroom, leaving Gregory standing alone on the terrace, and her hands were shaking, but her resolve was firm, and she found Richard waiting for her with a concerned expression, and she smiled at him and said she was okay, and better than okay, actually. Madison appeared beside Gregory on the terrace and asked what that was all about, and Gregory could not even look at her, and he mumbled something about an old friend. But Madison was not stupid, and she could see the pain in his eyes, and she realized she was just a replacement for someone he could never forget. Inside the ballroom, Samantha was approached by Victoria Chen, and a renowned investor who expressed interest in expanding Right Couture internationally, and Samantha's mind shifted from Gregory to business, and this was her moment and her night, and she was not going to let him take that away from her. As the gala continued, Samantha danced with her father and laughed with new friends and accepted congratulations from people who admired her work, and she felt lighter than she had in months. And the burden of wondering what Gregory thought or felt was finally lifted, and she realized she did not need his validation or approval. Near the end of the evening, Marcus Walker approached Samantha again, and this time Gregory was with him. Marcus introduced his son and said he had been telling Gregory about Samantha's impressive achievements, and the tension was palpable as the two men stood before her. Samantha maintained her composure and shook Gregory's hand formally, and Marcus noticed the strange energy between them, but said nothing. And he invited Samantha to visit Walker Industries for a potential collaboration, and she graciously accepted, knowing it would drive Gregory crazy to see her succeeding in his world. When the gala finally ended, Samantha and Richard climbed back into their limousine, and as the car pulled away from the hotel, Samantha looked back one last time and saw Gregory standing on the steps watching her leave, and this time she was the one driving away and leaving him behind. At home, Samantha tiptoed into Emma's nursery and watched her daughter sleep peacefully, and she kissed her forehead and whispered that they were going to be just fine and that she would always fight for them both. And Emma stirred slightly and smiled in her sleep. Richard knocked on the doorframe and told Samantha how proud he was of her, and he said she had shown incredible strength and grace tonight, and that her mother would have been so proud too. And Samantha hugged her father and thanked him for believing in her when she could not believe in herself. In the following weeks, Samantha's phone rang constantly with new opportunities, and Right Couture's orders tripled, and she hired more staff and opened a second location, and her life was busier than ever, but it was fulfilling in ways she never imagined. Gregory tried to reach out several times, leaving voicemails and sending flowers, but Samantha never responded, and she had meant what she said on the terrace, and she was done giving chances to people who did not value her, and Emma deserved a mother who knew her worth. One afternoon, Samantha received a letter from Gregory, and inside was a check for child support and a lengthy apology. He wrote that he understood if she never forgave him, but he wanted to take financial responsibility for Emma. And Samantha stared at the check for a long time before deciding to put it in a trust fund for Emma's future. She would not accept anything from Gregory for herself, but she would not deny her daughter resources that were rightfully hers, and it was not about him anymore. It was about doing what was best for Emma. Months turned into a year, and Samantha's empire continued to grow. She appeared on magazine covers and spoke at conferences and inspired countless women with her story. And she dated occasionally but was in no rush to find love. And she had learned that being alone was better than being with someone who did not cherish her. Emma took her first steps in the Right Couture flagship store, surrounded by fabric and designs, and Samantha cried happy tears as she watched her daughter toddle toward her. And this was her legacy. Not a man or a relationship, but the life she had built through determination and love. And as Samantha stood in her office overlooking the city, and she thought about that rainy night when Gregory had kicked her out, and she almost laughed at how that moment of devastation had actually been the beginning of her greatest triumph. And she had been forced to find her own strength, and in doing so had discovered she was far more powerful than she ever knew. The gala had been her declaration, and every day since then had been her victory. She was no longer defined by who had left her and by who she had become. And that woman was unstoppable.